I'm not the first person to point this out at all, but I really want to talk about it because I find it extremely interesting. Have you ever noticed that Sonic Unleashed and Mario Odyssey are like the same game? Obviously, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there are a lot of things about these two games that are strikingly similar to each other. So similar, in fact, that it almost kind of makes me go, did the Mario team rip off Sonic Unleashed for Mario Odyssey? Because the similarities between these two games, some of them are unbelievably uncanny. Not everything, of course. As far as like the core gameplay and design goes, these games are very, very different from each other, but a lot of the aesthetic and thematic elements of the games are basically the exact same thing, and the first time I played Mario Odyssey, I couldn't help but go, this is just like Sonic Unleashed, over and over and over as I was playing the game. And I want to point out these similarities because I think it's interesting. First and foremost, actually, would be the logos of the two games, actually. You might look at them at first and go, what are you talking about, Pariah? You're crazy. But if we swap out Sonic Unleashed for the Japanese version of the game, Sonic World Adventure, now suddenly we see quite a similarity here that both of these logos feature the Earth very prominently. And of course, that alludes to how both of the games are globe-trotting adventures. Even the titles of them are fairly similar. You know, Sonic World Adventure and Mario Odyssey. And Odyssey as in a big adventure that spans a very large area. The whole world in this case. And that similarity stems into many, many elements of the games. But beyond that, the games also have a lot of similarities in the execution of how they're presented to us. Because both games begin with what feels like the finale of another game in the series. We're already at what kind of feels like the final confrontation. The good guy versus the bad guy in a big showdown, and in both cases, the villain manages to defeat the hero and knock them off of the ship that they're fighting on. There's also an additional element of further communication of the hero being defeated at the beginning that is told to us in both games, through a very significant change to the visual identity of the character, Sonic being transformed into the Werehog and Mario having his hat destroyed. Both of these are meant to signify to us a very clear visual element of how the hero has been defeated. Then both games pick up from there with our hero plummeting into the earth in some unfamiliar location where they run into the little floating cutesy kind of mascot character that is going to be their companion throughout the following adventure. Also, in both cases, that character exhibits apprehension at meeting our hero until opening up to them, and they are both related to the main conflict that is going on and what the villain of the story is up to. Also, the game features new villains and enemies that are central to the main conflict going on here in the form of Dark Gaia in Sonic Unleashed and the Brutals in Mario Odyssey. Obviously, these are very different, but they also do have a number of similarities, as we'll see later going on. Another similarity is that both games are a lot more cinematic than previous entries in their respective series, to the point where they even both have a late kind of tasteful, classy title drop that they do. They do it at different points, but still, that is very, very similar. And of course, as I already talked about before, the biggest similarity between the two games is the element of them being world-spanning adventures. That is a very, very big thing in both games, and they execute a lot of those same ideas in very similar ways. For example, all the levels you go to in both games are different countries, or kingdoms in the Mario game is how they word it, but it's basically the exact same idea. And they communicate these ideas in similar ways in both games. For example, looking at the level select on both games, it is a look at the entire planet, and you actually get to see the locations on the Earth where all these different countries are located as you pick which one you're going to go to. If you really want to get specific about it, also in both games we travel from all these different locations using a red flying vehicle. Also, another big similarity in how both games kind of explore the idea of a world-spanning adventure is specifically in the theming of the different levels that we go to, as both games take inspiration from real-world locations for their level themes. They do it a little bit differently, though. Sonic Unleashed just directly takes real-world locations and turns those into levels, Whereas with Mario, it takes real-world locations and kind of alters them to more appropriately fit the Mario universe. You know, they're a little bit exaggerated and a bit more cartoonified, but definitely still very inspired by real-world locations. And funnily enough, a lot of the locations that both games use are almost identical in many cases. Both games feature an icy country that takes obvious inspiration from Alaska and Antarctica and stuff. They both feature very beachy, tropical-themed countries, and the big one, of course, is that both games have worlds that are obviously supposed to be New York City. Additionally, something that's a little bit different, but is still somewhat similar, is that both games kind of start the adventure in kind of an idyllic and beautiful location that is very water-focused. Mario Odyssey begins in the Ghost Cap world, but after that, that's kind of just like the tutorial area. We go to the Cascade Kingdom, which is very beautiful, and it has the waterfalls flowing, and that's kind of in a way similar to Apatos in Sonic Unleashed, with all of its beautiful water and the windmills, just this wonderful, lovely location to begin our adventure with. Also, I guess you could kind of call this a similarity in that both games have the main villain fortress-type level has an additional theme on top of it. It's not just the bad guy's lair like it is in most entries of the series. Bowser's Castle here is now instead themed around a Japanese castle, which it normally isn't, and Eggman's base in Sonic Unleashed is themed around an amusement park. So, you know, very different ideas there, but in both cases they wanted to do something a little bit different with the final bad guy fortress location. As far as gameplay stuff goes, like I said, the games are very, very different, but they do have some similarities here and there. But I wouldn't really say that the gameplay between the two games is really that similar, but the gameplay ideas and the way that they're themed and tied together with the game's story concepts, those are very similar. For example, in both games, we have the main collectibles being themed after astral bodies. We have moons in Mario Odyssey, and in Sonic Unleashed, we have sun and moon medals. And in both cases, those collectibles are tied into the main players of our story. The moons from Mario Odyssey are obviously connected to the Brutals and the moon itself, and how that plays a big part in things, whereas the sun and moon medals play into Light and Dark Gaia and how they represent the sun and the moon. Also, another similarity I would argue both games have is that on top of the gimmick of kind of this globe-trotting adventure, both games also have a secondary gimmick on top of that that is more gameplay-oriented than it is just how we're going to be theming the environments and the ideas of the story. In the case of Sonic Unleashed, obviously the werehog is that gimmick, and the idea of Sonic turning into a werewolf and that offering an entirely different style of gameplay. But an important thing to keep in mind is that the werehog is very tied to Dark Gaia and Dark Gaia creatures, as that is the majority of what you're going to be fighting during the nighttime gameplay of Sonic Unleashed. So this game's gameplay-oriented gimmick is very tied to the new enemy faction that was introduced in the game, which is then similar to the secondary gimmick of Mario Odyssey with the hats, and how everything is all hat-based in the game. You obviously have Cappy, and you use that as your weapon, as well as a way to introduce new alternative gameplay into the Mario formula, but additionally, also many enemies are wearing hats, and they also incorporate that into how they fight. And of course, our main new enemy faction, the Brutals, all of them fight with a focus on their hats. Again, very similar to the idea of Dark Gaia creatures being tied to the werehog gameplay of Sonic Unleashed. And then both game similarities come to a head even further once we reach the finale of both games, where in both cases, we have a game where we are exploring the entire world, going to all these different countries, going to all these different lands, seeing what the world has to offer, and all the different places and cultures and peoples that are there. And so naturally, in both cases, for the finale of such a game, we need to go even bigger. We need to go beyond the Earth. We've spent the whole adventure going all around the Earth, so now we need to go somewhere even grander than that. In the case of Sonic Unleashed, we go to the Earth's core, but in the case of Mario Odyssey, we go to the moon, which in both cases is the origin location of the new enemy factions introduced in these games. Dark Gaia resides in the Earth's core, and the Brutals are from the moon. And in fact, in Mario Odyssey, we even go into the moon's interior in a very similar way to what we see in Sonic Unleashed. And of course, we have the finales of both games, which, while executed very differently, they do both go for that idea of like a big, epic, spectacle-ridden climax where we really go crazy over the top with things in a very common way that you see in a lot of Japanese media. And there is also the musical similarities between the two games. Mario Odyssey was the first Mario game to have a big vocal theme song for the first time, which is nothing new for the Sonic series. But then, in addition to the game's main theme, both games also feature kind of a secondary main theme that is leitmotifed many times throughout the games that have a very similar vibe to them, where they both kind of communicate this very big, whimsical adventure. So yeah, Sonic Unleashed and Mario Odyssey, very, very suspiciously similar games. The fact that these two games have so many similarities between them, it becomes hard to imagine that the Mario team came to these ideas entirely independent of Sonic Unleashed. Is it possible that they played Sonic Unleashed and were like, hey, I bet you we could do that with Mario? Certainly that's a possibility, but you know what? To be honest, I actually don't think that's the case. I actually do believe that most likely this was just a matter of coincidence, kind of like an Ants and Bugs Life scenario, only 10 years separated from each other. While that may seem unlikely considering the heavy amount of similarities between the two games, I actually think it's fairly believable, because all you really have to think about is that all it would take for these two games to be similar is for them to come to the same core idea, and when you think about that core idea and you try to naturally extrapolate that, a lot of these ideas become very, very obvious. Like, both games, I think, are clearly rooted in the idea of having a game where we're going to be going around the entire world in this big, grandiose adventure. And so, naturally, both games come up with the idea of theming all the levels after real-world locations, as that's the way that they can communicate to us, the audience, that this is about going to different places. Because if we just have these be, you know, fantasy locations that would fit in either of these universes, then that wouldn't really feel any different from any normal entry in these games. We want to really make it feel like we're going all around the world, so we're going to pull inspiration from things that the audience is familiar with in real-world locations all around the world. And thus, when you're doing something like that, what are the obvious locations that you're going to hit? You want to get a lot of those extreme types of environments and extreme types of cultures that are very representative of the idea of the very different places and things you can see as you go around the world. And so something like a New York City themed level, that is very emblematic of America in many ways, and so it's a pretty obvious place to go to for a world theme. Similarly, of course, we want to explore very different natural environments, so you get an Arctic-themed area, a tropical-themed area. It's all very obvious stuff that pretty much anyone would come up with when theming your different levels around real-world places. And then in that same vein, the idea of, for our final location, where the climax of our game is going to take place, we have to escalate that further, beyond just places in the world. We need to go beyond the world, and so the Earth's core or the moon, those both make perfect sense as ways to go beyond just going around the Earth. And then, of course, naturally, we need to give a motivation for our character to go to these extreme locations, and having a new enemy that is from this location, that just makes perfect sense. Then, of course, in the case of both series, they are long-running series with many entries, and so we want to spice up the games with some new gameplay elements, and so we come to the ideas of the Werehog and the Hat stuff. And so, of course, obviously, we would want to tie these new gameplay elements into the thematic story elements of the game, and thus these things get tied together in similar ways. You see what I'm saying? Basically, the point I'm getting to here is that I don't think this is a case of the Mario team ripping off Sonic Unleashed for Mario Odyssey. I think this is more a case of great minds think alike. Both teams came up with that initial core idea, and they both naturally expanded that idea in similar ways because those are just obvious good ways to expand that idea. Anyone would have kind of come up with these same kinds of ideas because it just makes sense. It's just kind of weird seeing how insanely similar these games are, and imagining that it's just coincidence, but I do actually think it probably is just coincidence. Or maybe it's not. Maybe they did rip off Sonic Unleashed for Mario Odyssey. Who knows? Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.